Okay, so there have been some questions that were not discussed in more depth from the earlier session, and so I'll remind the three topics that were left. One was the difference on commons vs public spaces and in general. The other one was the question about consensus and the process of participating in decision making in the context that Ashish was talking about in the village with the community there that Giacomo raised, and also the question of Begum on values and principles and whether they are key ingredients or spices, and in general to comment a bit on that. So let's take them one by one and gather additional questions that you might have, or I invite the people who asked the questions to repose them, and then both Stavros and Ashish can comment, and then we can open the discussion to other issues. What do you think about that? Okay. So commons versus public. Any other question? Eric?
I don't think I mean, if everyone can hear me, I don't need to loudspeaker. For the
Hello?
I think we heard in the two presentations quite a set of cute proposals. Extremely cute, they're very public, they're very inclusive. I would love to live in a world like that, however, the world is not like that. So my question is, and that is to both, is that both in the very different ways assumed that the commons is a public affair. I beg to disagree with that, and I would like to suggest that the political moment of commoning is a process of radical exclusion. It's about the production, I would argue and exemplify it in a moment, is the production of a radically exclusive procedure of commoning in a process of politicization. Let me quickly give three historical and vitally important examples for me. That is, first of all, the workers' houses, the proletarian workers' houses, how central they were in producing a sense of identity, dignity, commoning as exclusive spaces, and they could only acquire that performative political force through the production of a radically exclusive commons, as Rancière explores so wonderfully in The Night of the Proletarian. Same could be argued about the feminist movement and how in the early days in particular the construction of these radically exclusive but wonderfully common spaces that we called refugee houses, women's houses, etc., which were radically exclusive. And everyone would, I think many would argue, agree how vitally important they are in the subsequent process of emancipation. And thirdly, today, the body of the most radically excluded or the bodies of the undocumented immigrants, particularly in the north, and how the construction of a common in spaces of asylum are so radically important in prefiguring a sense of identity, collectivity, and the production of a shared space through which a politicizing transformation can take place. So that is my first sort of question. Should we not really think about commoning as a politicizing procedure of producing exclusive spaces, but one that of a different kind, of the commons of the gated communities, etc. And my second question, quickly following up on that, is when Stavros talked about the good commons and the corrupted commons, my question was, who the hell is going to decide what a good commons is and a corrupted commons is? Clearly, Samaras thought about Syntagma Square as a corrupted commons. That's precisely what he called them in certain ways, while the other side, of course, saw it as a prefigurative experimentation with a new form of possible production of a commons. So is it up to us, the philosophers, to decide and discern what a corrupt commons is or a non-corrupt commons is. And then finally, in all of that, should we not be a bit careful to love our beloved poor and excluded too much? I have only seen figures and pictures of our beloved poor, who do these, our beloved poor excluded. I saw pictures in your talk about slum settlements where they produce these wonderful commons that we love to talk about in these settings here. And for India, I see also poor subaltern communities who do these wonderful things. Is it up to us philosophers to invoke these commons that are commons of exclusion, to celebrate them as the beacons for the future? I find this a bit problematic. So these are the three sort of issues.
So would you like to address that first, or get some more? Stavros? Eric's running.
I think that first of all, my presentation and my approach has indeed normative aspects. I said that I take sides. I'm not simply describing the situation. Neither am I attempting to say that every kind of common is interesting or perhaps is potentially connected to a different, more just society. Therefore, although I didn't choose the word good commons, I somehow adapted the term corrupted commons, that is not mine, it comes from Harder Negri, to describe the kind of commons that reverses its meaning because it's not open, because it does not develop in the process of including newcomers in the way Rancière talks about newcomers. So I would obviously suggest, like in a normative approach, that if we want to fight for commons which are meaningful in the process of constructing or attempting to construct a different, more emancipated and just society, we have to describe somehow what kinds of commons, what kinds of processes might possibly lead to this direction. And one of the ways that I tend to answer this question is through processes that are, as I described, the three elements, comparativity, translatability, and the sharing of power, which are indeed processes that sustain open commons. I'm not romanticizing about the commons of the excluded. What I have shown in my examples was indeed not the favelas or the villas miserias in Buenos Aires and admired the forms of organization, but no, what I showed and I tried, first of all, it was examples that they were examples that I have experienced in a way. And secondly, they were examples of a politicized, as you mentioned, intervention on this process that indeed has helped to open the borders, to open the boundaries through which boundaries those societies or those communities were excluded from the rest of the city and the rest of society. So commoning, both in Buenos Aires, in my example, and in São Paulo, were processes that were connected to a politicized intervention that was actually beyond the commoning practices, more like a defense against harsh conditions of people who live in favelas or villas miserias. Obviously, therefore, this is how I understand commons as a public issue. It is a public issue, but it's not a public issue in a uniform society, it's a public issue in an antagonistic society. And I think I would not hesitate in saying that I'm with those people who try in conditions of exclusion, in conditions of powerlessness, or in conditions of lack of rights, to establish forms that transcend the mere defense. And I admire the inventiveness of immigrants in Athens, or the inventiveness of neo-poor in Athens, which does not result simply in forms of survival with the same good old values of I will survive in spite of everything, but indeed develop from below new forms of collectivities. This is what I try to understand. This is how I problematize commoning. And I think that I'm more or less in this process in which roles and behaviors are clearly apparent. I'm not pretending to be part of Villas Miserias or more or less immigrant people in Athens, but I'm on the same side and I work towards that direction. I'm not simply an academic. I'm an activist too in that direction.
Thanks. The last sentence that Stavros spoke, I could say in exactly the same words. Yeah, we take sides. I guess all of us, in one way or the other, do take sides. For me, I think what's important in these initiatives, the examples I gave and many others that I can give, are that these are attempts at trying to actually reach towards some of the values that they hold dear and that I share with them, including the ones that I put up on the slide. But broadly, attempts at trying to get towards more ecologically sustainable, more socially just, more equitable societies. Yeah. In doing that, yes, some of these are commons that are also spaces of exclusion. There's no doubt about that. But the exclusion is of those elements which would actually undermine that particular community or society, right? These are not exclusions of other disempowered or excluded people. If they were, I would have a problem. So for instance, in Eastern India, Northeast India, we have a huge issue of Bangladeshi migrants coming in. And there are massive conflicts with local communities also. Now, these are very complex conflicts because they're conflicts not just, well, they're conflicts on the use of natural resources, which are often scarce. They're conflicts which are ethnic sometimes, Hindu, Muslim, or other ethnicities, tribal, non-tribal, indigenous people, non-indigenous people, and so on. I mean, there's multiple levels and sources of tension and conflict. Now, one can either see that in terms of saying, look, there's an existing community there and everything else should be excluded, including poor migrants who might actually be worse off than even the existing residents. Or you can look at it in terms of saying, can we actually start a negotiation and a dialogue process which enables the disprivileged on both sides, the existing residents and those who are moving in, to in some way coexist. And that actually should ideally be the role of the state, which it often doesn't perform, but it should be the role of the state and or civil society to help, to enable, to facilitate this kind of a dialogue. So the open commons, which is I think the word that Stavros used, is what one would then say are processes of commoning, which are in some ways, yes, exclusionary, but also open for other disprivileged or disempowered sections of society. But they are excluding those who will come in and take the land away for industry or for some other purpose. Yeah? So that, in that sense, if you mean that, yes, these are exclusionary, then I agree with that. But I think that's good exclusion. I don't frankly know the examples you gave of housing. Maybe it's a European context, which I'm not familiar with. So I can't say very much about that, but certainly on migrants, that is my position. The last point you made, I'm not absolutely sure I understood it, but are you saying that it is too much to celebrate these sorts of examples or initiatives? Or maybe if you could just restate, because I don't, did you understand that last point that was made? I didn't fully follow.
I'll try to express it a bit better than I did. Jacques Rancière, in his work, in one of his books entitled "The Philosopher and His Sport," he tries to make the case that the history of emancipation tormented history, important history as it is, has been marked by historical condition by which it was us, the philosophers, to decide what equality is, what emancipation is, what is just or what is unjust. And we keep having, of course, elaborate controversies philosophically, sociologically, politically about what is just and unjust, what is corrupted and uncorrupted, etc. His point is that by doing so, that is the attempt to philosophize, to find a philosophical theoretical basis for emancipation and justice, we reproduce the very conditions of disempowerment and exclusion that we philosophers allegedly are taking as our intellectual and political target, and continue by doing so to silence the voices and practices of those who do in their practices define what equality is and what emancipation is. And he therefore suggests that we should radically, we philosophers, academics, should radically refrain from ethical or other attempts to found or base an emancipatory or transformative politics on. In contrast to that, he suggests that what philosophers can usually do is to think through what the moments, procedures, and possibilities of emancipatory radical transformation are, and what the specific role is of us, philosophers, academics, etc., in this process, which is nonetheless initiated, structured by those who, not having a voice in the practice of its staging, acquire a voice. And it's the universalization of that acquisition of voice which is a central part of the process of emancipation. And that consequently, he is making a case for a shift in the terrain of intellectual inquiry. And that's what.
Yeah, sorry, now I understood. And I actually totally agree with him, if that's what he's saying, completely. And if that's what you're saying, I totally agree with you. If you noticed in my presentation, and actually even in the book, we don't refer very much to any dominant ideology. We don't refer very much to Gandhi or to Marx or to any of the others that you can think of, saying, okay, this is emanating from those, wonderful as they might be, interesting as they might be. Actually, for me personally, it's been a 35-year journey of learning from the grassroots initiatives. And if I'm putting up a set of values or whatever, it's not stuff I've cooked up in my head or has come from any of the theoretical readings I may have done, which actually I've done very little. But it's actually my interpretations of what I'm hearing from these grassroots. Another process, the process that I described of the alternatives confluence, which we've been doing for the last some time now, is actually a process of bringing together these different initiatives at the grassroots, the communities themselves and groups working with them, to think through not just the practicals of what they're doing, but the conceptuals of what they're doing. And what I find amazing is, not amazing, I shouldn't find it amazing and surprising, but I do because that's part of my elitist upbringing, is that if you sit with Devaji Tofa, who's been the sort of indigenous leader of that one example I gave you of direct democracy, he can speak for a few hours at a conceptual level in his own language. I need to make the effort of understanding that language, and then, of course, I will say what I think also, and he will say what he thinks, and then together we maybe bring up a conceptual framework which resonates maybe with another few such initiatives elsewhere in the country, or maybe not. They add their own. So that's the attempt, and I don't know whether it kind of matches what you're saying, but it's certainly not about imposing one's own frameworks on a lived reality and saying this is what's happening. It's actually attempting to learn from. Now in India that's particularly difficult because 800 languages means, I only speak 3. So one necessarily has to go through intermediaries, and that has its own problems, etc. So it's not by no means is it a perfect process, but the process is to try and respect those articulations that are coming from the ground, and then to try and see what common ground there might be, not just by me, but actually getting them together on common platforms, providing a space, a facilitation for that cross-cultural and cross-community dialogue.
You both. The next issue was on consensus and participation, but maybe you want to clarify? Yeah.
Okay, I think this is a, let's say I will start to think about it as an activist, and I think it's a very crucial point because it's participating in some of what we can define according to categories that I share. That, for example, Stavros presented this morning. I participated in Barcelona in different commons, okay? But my problem was always thinking how I can avoid elitist drift of my practices that sometimes I was in. Like I was part of a children care group or cooperative of health and so on and so forth. So the problem that came in my mind as an activist was always how I relate my practices with the practices of the state in those aspects. Let's say how my practices of taking care and participate to the process together with other family about education and so on will change the way in which the state, okay, the public space of education can change. This is, I think it's very crucial, because if we don't put this question and we just look at our practices, we always risk an elitist drift. So this is a very crucial point. So for example, in my case, I was trying to experience how the healthcare cooperative can enter the national system and change the way in which now is theorized the idea of health. Now we theorized and practice through the institution the idea, and we fight against disease. I mean, this is a very important, crucial point that we have to think about. And I think this is on the intellectual level is what, in a very powerful way, Eric is trying to say. But in practice, we can see it. How we universalize, how we avoid elitist practices. No? And this is how we occupy and we change the institution of the state in which we live in. This is very important. And this is, for example, the way in which I think probably, I don't know if we can I can disagree with Eric on that those practices can teach us through the practices and reflecting, I will say as an organic intellectual of those practices, to help me to change the state in which I live in, okay? So I think this is very crucial. I mean, I will not dismiss the practices at all. I think they are very important, because are the practices through which my role as organic intellectual, not as an academic, as an organic intellectual, so as a part of a practices, can help me to reflect on how I enter the institution of health, I enter the institution of education to change it.
So I think there are also some other thoughts on this issue of commons and state and institutions.
I'm Felipe, I'm from ENTITLE. I have been working a lot in conflicts that I am now understanding. Maybe there is this relationship on commons and what is the public. And one of my struggle is to understand the role of the state, of the multiple agents of the state in this issue. That I would like to ask you something related to that. And the examples that I can I present to you is in India, the Odisha struggle against the Vedanta mining in Wara mountain that maybe it was a public land, and they were against the mining arriving there, supported by the state. And then I present you two cases from the Amazon that I find extremely complex and interesting. One is one indigenous group that decided to self-demarcate their land in opposition of the state bringing loggers to a public land. So it was an extremely sustainable logging, let's say, without the technology to extract timber and protect it. But Indians were against that, and they self-demarcated the land against the state in order to appropriate the land, which will belong to the state, but in a different relationship as indigenous land, not as a public forest that could have a mine extraction. And another one is not on land, but on the river. There is one of the most beautiful rivers in the Amazon, the Tapajós River, and there is one project to build 5 huge dams there. And the insurgents of the Munduruku communities, the Munduruku group, I don't know, even if you can call them communities, they have villages and then dispersed communities, some huge villages, small one, but there's the insurgency of this group against the building of dams there, 5 huge dams. River is public, it's federal, some parts are from the state, so it's very complex relationship to each part of the state they can dialogue with, and they are facing the army, let's say, a very violent process, and it becomes a very complex debate once other parts of the country, such as people in São Paulo or in other cities, they are reclaiming that this river is public and we need to produce energy there for the development of the country. And then you have one community that want to protect their livelihood. And then I think it was a very tense debate in the public opinion. I was always defending the Munduruku, but it wasn't an easy issue to say that this is a public river and the country deserves the development, and they are reclaiming some common other use, but they were also reclaiming that they were defending their whole country for the future of the territory, let's say.
Is it related to this question? Great.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Lucas. I'm from Zurich. I'm writing a paper on the commons and democracy in political philosophy. And in that sense, I'm very much confronted with exactly these problems of normative and, how do you call it, more understanding the conditions of possibility to enable people to define themselves and their own norms. But I'd like to, I mean, my question goes exactly in this direction, and it's more of a practical question in that sense. In the sense of, we see these images and hear these stories of empowerment, I'd say. And still we see demographically, or also in the sort of political landscapes, of large populations voting conservative for conservative politics. And what I mean by conservative politics is supporting capitalist state politics. And in that sense, it goes in this direction of, communal land, commons, that a few people have access to and can use in relation to a larger population that want what I'd call capitalist modernization. And how to go about that? I mean, really as a practical question, because if you have a majority of people not wanting local eco-radical democracy, what do we do? That's
Okay, maybe we take these long questions.
I think, but obviously we are offering opinions in very large issues now, anyhow. So just suggesting some possible lines of thinking. First of all, obviously, any kind of discussion on the political issues related to commons or commoning has to face the problem of the state. This is being proven not simply in academic discussions, which are still considered as very important, but also in issues connected to specific struggles. So what is the role of the state? Is the state some kind of referee who's kind of trying to keep on the rules between establishing those rules for negotiations between different communities? Is the state imposing those rules? And what is the legitimacy of the state? I would say that obviously, as long as we have these kinds of societies that we live in, capitalist societies of a specific form of domination, we cannot ignore the state. The problem is, do we see in those practices elements, not simply figurative, but indeed actually happening, that can show that there are other forms of social organization that are not necessarily statist? These areas, I think, are very interesting. Obviously, these forms are in a nascent form. They are emergent. They are not very sure about themselves either. And sometimes they fall apart because they are confronted with huge, immense forces, especially coming from the state. But I think it is important to see if those examples or practices, some of the examples shown by Ashish before, or some of the examples that I've tried to draw from Latin American cities, are these, in a way, having ingredients or elements that show that then different forms of organization, social organization, can indeed exist? I strongly believe that the state is a form of social organization which has its history. And it is a specifically historical product. It's not the destiny of humankind. And I believe that what we have seen from the functioning of the state, and obviously I'm just condensing a huge discussion here, is that the state is a specifically oriented class hegemonic mechanism. So it is happening in specific forms, and it's doing specific things to specific societies. One important aspect of those experiences, and also the attempts of reflecting on those experiences, is perhaps to see how we have possibilities of going beyond the state. This is not obviously the only area in which commoning is interesting. It involves our everydayness. For example, commoning practices in Athens today are indeed forms through which I can defend my life. When we share things in our university, when we share things in our neighborhoods, when we share things in the squares or in collective kitchens, we are defending our lives. We are not imagining of a different society. But nevertheless, this can teach us a lot of things about what it means to go beyond what exists. And I think what has made a difference at the last, let's say, 10 years in the discussion about commoning is the fact that we have experiences erupting everywhere in the world from people who have lost their faith in the state. Maybe they haven't lost their faith in representative democracy yet, or in the forms of the representative democracy, or in the blackmails, if you want, connected to representative democracy, as it is in our Western societies. And maybe there's a lot of things to be done in trying to show that those conditions, financialization and destruction of society, are inherently connected to these forms of representative democracy. There's a lot of things to be shown to those people, to us also. So there are many contradictions in our behaviors. We can be more oriented towards collective behavior in certain aspects of our life and still be trapped in the idea that some will represent us, and especially those who are already have proven that they are corrupt and they are functioning towards the repetition of what exists. So let's not forget that the ways that people react to existing power relations are not simply, are neither coherent and neither are indicative of what can be done. So let's not become disappointed from the fact that people still vote in various areas conservative governments, and at the same time, in the level of their everydayness, do a lot more progressive things than those governments are promising. This is a part of a dynamics which is indeed contradictory. And just to sum my thesis, my suggestion, it's like going back to history. How did feudalism evolve or change to capitalism? It was a long process in which seeds of the next form of society were being contradictorily cultivated or shaped inside the former one. So maybe we are experiencing a long period in which the beyond capitalist society is being, in a way, is happening in various minuscule forms inside this society. I cannot think of other ways of how to understand this beyond. I'm not in a position of describing this beyond as if I'm a visionary or a prophet, but I see seeds of this beyond, and I try to take part on those seeds. And this is about the ethics of the philosopher and the poor. I'm neither a philosopher, nor I'm very fond of being the father of the poor. No, I'm against this idea of enlightened avant-garde, communist and anarchist included. But I think there are many things that can be done because we have certain privileges as intellectuals, organic intellectuals, which we can share with those who do not have them. It's important for those experiences to reflect upon themselves. If we can contribute on that, it's really very important. This is what I did participating in Syntagmas Core or in other initiatives in Athens, or watching and learning from initiatives in Latin America. We can learn, but we can also say a word. I don't know if Rancière has ever participated in any kind of movement. Okay? And I'm not sure if this kind of confessing on the role of intellectuals is part of the history of French intelligentsia. This is not part of my history.
Okay, well, I think building on that, sort of agreeing with most of everything that Stavros just said. Well, let me do this in 2-3 different ways, and also come back to Giacomo's question on consensus, because we still have to deal with that. I think the issue of the 3 examples that you gave, Felipe, including the one from India, which in fact last week I was there with the indigenous people who threw out the mining corporation. The history of the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial history of India is really crucial to look at in that context. And I guess for all countries that have faced, all peoples that have faced colonial pasts, that the definition of public land, this goes back to, I think, the distinction that Stavros had made. The definition of public land is actually it's state-owned or state-dominated or state-controlled land. And so those hills and forests in which that indigenous people live and for whom it's been their traditional territory or their traditional, they don't even call it territory because they don't say it belongs to us. It actually belongs to Niyam Raja, who is this sacred entity that governs everything. It's 2 completely different narratives of who does that land belong to or who belongs to that land. Yeah. And so the government takes it upon itself to say we are the ones who will determine what happens to that land because the public has elected us and we own that land technically. Whereas what the indigenous people are saying is that is simply not, we never accepted you as, this is an imposed history on us. Yeah, if you look at the discussions and dialogues even when independence came in India, a lot of the indigenous peoples were saying, what is India? For us, it doesn't make sense. We should be the ones governing this area. We've been living here for 1,000 years, 3,000 years, and we should be the ones. Who are you in New Delhi? Okay, earlier it was London, now it's New Delhi. For us, it makes no difference. So that whole narrative of colonization in one way or the other, even if it's not external colonization, it's internal colonization, is very crucial to look at in the distinction between public and commons. Yeah. So I would say that therefore that's how one needs to respond to people who say, well, if that's public land, then we are entrusting the government to decide what should be done there, produce electricity or do mining or whatever it is. And I think one needs to confront it from that perspective, from the historical perspective. Which then brings to question the whole role of the state, and especially in this case, I would say the nation state. It's really crucial, I think, to distinguish the two. If you look at the broad notion of state, it's a regime of governance that a people decides. We have come to think of the state only from the nation state perspective. And the nation state, to my mind, is a fundamentally flawed, from an ecological and social and equity perspective, there's some fundamental flaws there. In India, and this also responds to the question that, I'm sorry, I didn't get your name when you asked about what's... No. The question about Lucas. Sorry, I didn't get the name. It also responds to your question of why is it that despite all these progressive initiatives, conservative governments are still voted into power. I see it as a complex situation, partly what Stavros was also saying, but to add to that, is that you get this thing where people who are sick and tired of governments not doing what they're supposed to be doing in terms of services and so on and so forth, and so they actually get to becoming self-organizing and so on wherever it's possible, are still stuck in a situation of a nation state which has over the last 60-70 years built up this whole narrative of there's Pakistan on this side and China on that side and blah blah blah. So you need a strong central government, and so they're seeking in one way or even as they're doing things on the ground themselves, they're seeking that in New Delhi there needs to be a strong government. And what's a strong government? A strong government is somebody like Mr. Modi, who's currently our Prime Minister, who sort of comes out as being the guy who will save India from all these elements from all over the world, including supposedly extremist elements within India. And so you vote that government into power. It's a combination, it's that. It's also the fact that over 200 years of centralized politics and governance, people's self-confidence in self-governance has been continuously eroded. You will go to most villages in India and say, look, this is what's happening in that village. They'll say, they'll take them a very long time to actually say, yes, we have the confidence to actually do this for ourselves. They are seeking government support, or they want somebody sitting up there to actually do it for them. So it's also that. I mean, it's this, erosion of self-confidence which is also playing into the election of governments which are seen as being strong and which will help them. And it's the confidence in, or it's the faith in representative democracy, which has also been shoved down our throats over the last few decades, that this is the only form of democracy that's viable. So you think that, yeah, okay, voting is, India is called the world's biggest democracy simply because 700 million people go to vote, which is stupid, I think. I mean, of course, it's important. I'm not saying that's not important. But surely it should be the world's biggest democracy if, in fact, direct democracy was working. Not because we go to vote once in 5 years and then sort of wring our hands and tear our hair and say, oh, that guy's not doing the right thing for us. Next elections, we'll choose somebody else. So I think it's a combination of all of these things that we're seeing playing out in this contradiction that you pointed out. So therefore, I think the notion and the confidence that we can have different ways of doing politics, different forms than just the nation state, is something that's that's building up. I think it's building up. You see it in the movements around the world, but it will take, I would say, maybe even a few decades to figure out what those different states could be, different forms of political organizing. And I would even say different forms of state, not nation state, different forms of state as regimes of governance could be. It's a long drawn out process, it's not going to be overnight. Quickly on the consensus thing, Giacomo, you asked me this question in Barcelona also, and I think I wasn't able to give you a satisfactory answer, partly because I'm for myself, I'm thinking through these things. But a couple of thoughts. The image, because you pointed to this image there, is actually a very interesting one. One is, of course, you need to understand the cultural context of the men and the women sitting separately, and supposedly the women seeming like they're sitting on the side. To me, actually, that's a very interesting way by which women, even if not articulate, are able to bring their power to the thing, because they are able to confer amongst themselves sitting like that, and at least one amongst them who might be articulate is able to then present the point of view. Whereas if they were all scattered, it may not happen. So it's a form of, it's a very subtle form of self-organizing, which helps maybe in some cases to balance out the point you made, that in a consensus decision-making process, the person who's articulate, or the people who are articulate, are the ones who are going to be determining the decision. Secondly, this is only one process that happens. In that village, a number of other sub-assemblies are also organized, in which people, before the main assembly happens, they actually are able to discuss this. So the women will meet separately, the youth sometimes will meet separately, etc., or other interest groups will. And those ideas or those opinions can actually then get reflected in the full assembly. Third, even in a voting process, who is to say that what has been articulated before the vote will not influence the process? Surely. I mean, what a politician says before the national elections or a state elections or a local elections surely has an impact on our minds about who we will vote for. So it seems like a more open and neutral process, voting, but I question that, because finally, how does a decision get taken in our head? It's on the basis of who has articulated what, and of course on the basis of my own particular situation, economic, cultural, political situation, etc. So I don't think there's anything inherent in a voting process which makes it less liable to biases and influence than compared to a consensus-making process. Having said that, I do agree that consensus has its limitations. We cannot obviously work with consensus at all scales and in all situations. So I would say that I think we should be open to different forms of political decision making, and try to ensure that the processes by which the voiceless, the excluded, the silent, have a voice. And there are multiple processes by which to do that. Make sure that those processes, as far as possible, are in place, whether it is consensus or it's voting or secret voting. I mean, even so, secret voting has the same problems, to my mind. So that's what my response to the consensus. There's lots of other issues, but let me stop here.
Okay, thank you. Maybe now we open a little bit the discussion beyond these themes, things that have come up, and I have already Yorgos and Salvatore on the list. Let's collect 3 questions at a time, maybe, and then a lot of people here. I don't know who raised their hands first. But.
Hello. Thanks to both of you for the information and the presentations. Okay, for Ashish that probably doesn't know me, I'm Yorgos and I'm from the ENTITLE group, studying in Greece. So my question, I'm not sure if it's related to this round or the previous one, but anyway, it has to do again with the question of power, but in a different sense. I have the feeling that sometimes when we are discussing about the commons, we deal with powerless people trying to give very specific materialistic answers to their everyday lives, for example, the water management, and this brings up opportunities for further consideration and not the other way around, because sometimes I have the feeling we're doing the other way around. We pre-assume that people want to work on a democratic basis and then find answers to their everyday problems. And I say that because my question is more or less like this. How these initiatives or, I don't know, living common practices and etc. can last in time and scale. And this is the question. Okay, it's a bit abstract, but it is in the line that as I expressed before. Thank you.
Hello, I am Salvatore, also from ENTITLE, and I would like to think together about two issues. One connected to the relation between commons and commoning practices and what is external to them, and the one connected to the internal organization. So first, I would like to ask, don't you think we should be whenever we talk about commons and commoning, also take into account the issue, as also Eric said before, of boundaries. So that means what also the commons is trying to oppose in terms of processes that can undermine it. And this brings me to the issue of shouldn't we think, when we think of commons, also about resistance in the terms of we know well that commons can help communities sustain themselves, but at the same time there are above and within flows of global power and capital that constantly undermine the condition of possibilities. And the biggest that comes to my mind is climate change, that gives also a sense of urgency. So we can be very good at organizing our life in common, but if at the same time we do not address with urgency and commitment the external forces that are threatening us and the world, then there will be no space for any kind of alternative socio-ecological arrangement. So also about the seeds of the future society. If we really want a future society, we have to fight and confront the violence that constantly is threatening the condition of possibility of life itself. And secondly, about the internal organization of the commons, and this is more directed to Stavros, because I found it really interesting, the reflection about the indeterminacy of the commons as the condition of possibility for welcoming difference and tolerate instability. But how do you, connect this way of organizing the commons with a reality that also philosophers have spoken about the necessity for grounding the existence, that people have the need to actually cling to some stability in order to feel secure. And this also is connected to the issue of migrants creating their own communities where they can somehow refill some sort of stability against all the instability around. Thank you.
One more, or is this too much?
I would like to prioritize a question from a woman because there have been no questions.
I have Christos and Rita.
And then after, we'll continue.
Hello, I'm Rita. And, well, I have a quite general question. But sometimes I feel that talking about commons and commoning, how do we avoid talking about islands in a sea of inequalities, injustice, of oppressions and dominations? How the islands can change behaviors, practices, and try to deal with these contradictions, but how to deal with the general context. And if to deal with this sea of inequalities is not needed to confront who has the economic power and the state power, and in this sense, how to engage these alternative practices and into also forms of political people that are political activists that confront these roots of the oppression, of exploitation and domination. And in this sense, sometimes I feel also that these islands, they are based on a negation of something that is outside. And in being a negation, there is no perspective that they arise from the inner contradictions of capitalism and the dominant power relations. So how to, let's say, be more dialectical in this relation? How to confront who has the power to change things? Stavros mentioned, for instance, a passage from feudalism but in reality, the bourgeoisie had gained the economic power, and then violently, through violence, it gained the state power. So can we think about economic power and state power in a form very smooth, that we change our minds, we change our practices, and this step by step will progress for a better world? Or should we confront ourselves with the contradictions that are produced by capitalism and also by state power that has the power of violence also?
Three, and then we go do another round.
Is there going to be another round though?
All the possible topics. And last but not least, the problem of revolution. First of all, I need to say it once more, not just a, pure theatrics of the speaker, but I just want to contribute some thoughts on those issues, which are very big, and they cannot be answered by somebody who knows. I'm not the one. I don't think that nobody is in this position. However, we can talk about those problems. In many times we can call upon certain experiences that are happening. For example, the problem of scale that was raised by Yorgos. Indeed, and Harvey has done that a lot, saying that, okay, this is for a not a very high level of scale discussion. Yes, we can be very good and democratic in our neighborhoods, but what about the change of society? It is in fact true that we have examples of scale, and we tend to ignore them, or we put them in parentheses as if they are exceptions. So at least to my mind, there are two very important alive problems that show that all those things can happen on a different scale and can influence the lives of people and can create alternative forms of social organization. I will not explain those two examples, but you know them. It's the Zapatistas in Mexico and the Kurdish Rojava region in Syria. Okay? These are examples in scale. These are not micro communities. These are communities that have very complex forms of self-governance. Indeed, the Zapatistas have even more complex forms of decision-making, levels of representation, rotation, problems of arranging decisions that having to do with productive choices, and so on and so forth. So this is not a pure question that can be posed anytime under whatever circumstances. Maybe we can learn about the problems that are being faced by those, at least those two examples. And I think these are two examples that show, for at least to my mind, that show that there are opportunities that societies can be created or reinvented from below with different priorities, with different forms of decision-making, and with different understandings of what it means to participate in a shared world or in a common world. We can talk about the deficiencies, the problems, but they are real, equally real, as is the Chavez or the Cuban form of government. Okay? They are equally real. So let's not start from zero when we talk about problems of scale. And they face the problem of state in a different way. They have not developed their own state-like forms. They explicitly try to create different kinds of society governance. On this I would a bit disagree with my friend Ashish. This is not, the state does not describe any kind of governance. I think it's a very historically specific form of governance, government actually, and especially, of course, connected to the national state or the colonial state. But this is a big discussion and big issue. When I'm talking about the state, I'm talking about this historically specific form of social organization, and I think we see already in our times. We have indeed important experiments of scale. And second, indeed people, us, because I consider myself as part of the people. I'm talking about the people as they were out there. Indeed, us sometimes participate in common initiatives as ways of preserving our essentials or preserving the opportunity to, in a way, control our lives. Maybe I've experienced more of these things in the period of crisis in Athens than I have experienced before. But why, please, do we think that people, when they do such things, they simply try to survive, whereas when we talk about those things, we are theorizing and philosophizing about democracy? People also dream about equality, and they dream in their own ways, in their own procedures, in their own opportunities. People enjoy solidarity. Solidarity is not a term only. Solidarity has explicit results in our lives. And allow me to believe that solidarity, freedom, and equality are indeed experiences that can prove that we can live in a more just world. They are not values only. About Salvatore's suggestions, I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree that we have to address what he said, the urgency of the situation. I'm not saying that all those experiments on a micro level should replace any kind of resistance against the state and the forms that it has taken in various places of the world. Indeed, we have to urgently fight back, and I don't agree with those that want to replace organized or unionized responses to austerity, for example, policies, with let's take our lives in our hands. No, we should do both. I strongly believe that we should do both, and one feeds from the other. So there is no disagreement on that. And if you want a more, let's say, romanticized expression of that, but it comes out of a movement also. It also comes from Zapatista movement. We want to fight capitalism, is what Marcos said, with ways that do not resemble capitalism. We want to have means that are similar to the ends that we are fighting for. So this is a process, and I agree with that, on that with Ashish. Many of those things we don't know how to do, but we learn from those experiences, and it's bad to start from zero. And yes, indeed, communities under threat many times tend to self-enclose, to enclose themselves in a desperate, sometimes, attempt to protect themselves. And this is also should be contextualized historically. Indeed, I would not condemn, in conditions of harsh attack by fascists, those immigrants that try to organize themselves. And I would have been part of those attempts to fight back, or to at least protect those who are not, who are powerless. Yes, sometimes we have to do those things, but let's not make them our ideals. Our ideals are beyond enclosure. They want us to make all our responses in the form of enclosure. We should, in a way, go beyond this self-enclosing process. And of course, I deeply sympathize with all the fights and the struggles who try to protect the most vulnerable. But well, it has a long history on that matter. And last but not least, the islands and in the end revolution later. I'm not obviously saying that all this will develop smoothly as all those experiences and experiments add to each other and you know, pile up to a nice and beautiful social democratic utopia. No, there are bound to be ruptures. Of what kind, I really don't know. I know, however, certain kinds of ruptures that have proven to be not of the way that means should look like the ends. One kind of ruptures that I believe that from our experiences as movements, as political initiatives and so on and so forth, we should question very strongly is this idea of avant-garde and the idea that some are chosen to perform something in the name of others. If this is the idea through which we can again talk about important ruptures or revolutions, I'm strongly against it. But indeed there are periods, and we have experienced periods, in which we have a confluence, is a beautiful word that was used by Ashish, and I very much like the fact that this is a sacred area in India, a confluence of things that might produce very important ruptures. So indeed, but I think that there is also a term that we should add in the process of understanding these kinds of experiments of commoning, if they are to go in the process towards the direction of changing in various ways the society. And this is the fact that we should not understand them, we should not accept them as islands. This is why I'm trying to develop a theoretical proposal, which is drawn from what I have seen, read, and discussed with people, a theoretical proposal of expanding commoning. Expanding is exactly refusing to create islands, is creating metastatic conditions of commoning, is creating contagious conditions of commoning. This might be kind of a result, and this, mind you, has been indeed a political problem in very concrete experiences of commoning. I have in mind a very minor example coming from Athens, a self-managed park that was constructed by a neighborhood initiative in Athens, which had always to face the problem, are we building an autonomous space in which nobody else is allowed? And this is our alternative form of publicness, or are we trying to do something that would catalyze new forms of publicness in this neighborhood? And this was a direct clash between the opinions. This resulted in different choices. This has, for example, resulted in somebody trying to expel somebody else, or somebody actually being against somebody else. So this is a political problem indeed. And that's why I think that, and I would take sides with those who were trying to open this process to the neighborhood. But of course, protect it from the drug dealers. With the drug dealers, you cannot create inclusive communities. So this is indeed, it has a historical aspect. But in terms of normative suggestions, I think we should develop proposals. Think about those proposals.
Okay, not going to repeat anything of what Stavros said because I agree with all of this. On the issue of the state, I think at lunch we'll sit because I want some of your understanding of what the word state is. So we can do that at lunch. On time and scale, I think going beyond, just building on what he said, I think the one of the biggest issues that a lot of these initiatives on the ground face is the threat of the dominant political and economic system. So the ability of actually networking amongst these initiatives in order to actually sustain themselves is absolutely crucial. Which also relates to the island, the question of islands, because yes, many of them right now are, in some way or the other, they're islands, but the more they're able to actually get together, network, learn from each other, build common space, common grounds, build solidarity networks with civil society, and so on and so forth, the less they are islands. Not just in a physical sense, but also, I think, crucially in the sense of ideas and mindsets and the shifts of mindsets that are needed. But let me give you a quick example of this, which is actually playing out on the ground right now. It's not as interesting and dramatic as the Zapatista and the Kurdish one, which Stavros mentioned, but somewhat, which is the overturning of 200 years of history of forest enclosure in India by a groundswell leading to a legislation, and there also you see somewhere maybe a little bit of a progressive role of the state, a legislation which actually allows or which enables and mandates communities to take community control back over forests. And we now have about 1 million acres in India which actually communities have reclaimed as their commons. How did this happen? Well, as I said, there was a groundswell of forest dwelling communities, indigenous peoples asking for this. But then the implementation of a law like this is always a very difficult one, because you have the bureaucracy which is resistance, you have the state which is, other parts of the state which are resistant, etc. And you have communities, like I said earlier, who have lost their own self-confidence in being able to reclaim the commons and govern them. It happened only because of the possibility of networking amongst the forest dwelling communities, which on their own may not have happened, through sensitive, sympathetic civil society organizations, which enable them to come together in different parts of the country and at a national level and say, okay, this is what we're attempting to do, this is what you're attempting to do, how do we actually learn together, how do we together form an advocacy platform and a practical sort of learning platform in order to expand this growing reclaiming of the forest commons. So that's where then islands become transformed into becoming networks and collaborations. So I think it's entirely possible, and they do this not by saying, okay, this is my backyard, so I'm going to do this, or this is my backyard, so I don't want this project, this is my backyard, so I'm going to reclaim the forest commons, but actually also enabling themselves to put it into the larger context of what the state is doing and what capitalism is doing. So that then becomes what you're saying. So it's not just a negation, it actually is a confrontation and or a dialectic in which they are saying, this is our understanding of the current system and this is how we want it to change. Not just in my backyard, but much more nationally or globally. So, which also then helps to actually build time and scale. Temporal sustainability and also larger scale into the process. The quick thing I want to say about scale is that I think we would be making a mistake if we were to think of scale as being replicability. So we have a good example somewhere and we try and replicate it on scale. As I said earlier, this is the mistake that I think both governments and NGOs have made. Scale is about the values and the sharing of power and things like that, not really about simply saying that this worked here, so this watershed management example worked here, so let's use the same techniques somewhere else. So I think scale has to be looked at very differently. And finally, on the resistance thing, Salvatore, I absolutely, as also Stavros agreed, I totally agree, resistance is part of this. But what I have found, at least in India, is that resistance movements are able very often to stop a threat. Revolutionary movements are able to even overturn a regime that they don't like, as has happened in some parts of India, not nationally, but some parts. But then they flounder for what next? And very often, unfortunately, then they fall back into the same centralized systems, or what's happening in some parts of Latin America, they fall back on neo-extractivism instead of extractivism. And so it's because you haven't, not just thought, nobody can think through the future totally, but at least the visioning that is needed, saying, okay, we are overthrowing this regime or we are resisting this project, but how do we then move into the future in a way that's fundamentally different from what we are trying to change, from what we're fighting? Let me give you a quick example, the same one that Felipe, you raised. With the Dongria Kond indigenous community was able to, that's the picture, by the way, of the indigenous people. They were able to stop the mining company. But in the last few months, we've been going and talking to them. They're actually facing, to my mind, a bigger threat, which is state welfare schemes, education, health, roads, and a couple of other things, right? Where the state is coming in saying, we want to help you develop. We want to help you become part of the mainstream. They don't say civilized anymore, that used to be said in the past, but that's what they mean. We want to help you to become civilized. Now, that comes in a very subtle way, it comes in a very devious way, it comes in ways of saying, okay, you don't have schools, we'll give you schools. But the teachers are going to be coming from outside and they will be teaching in the state language, the official language, not in the language of the Dongriya Kond. We'll give you hospitals or clinics, but of course the doctors there will be allopathic doctors in your own systems, are primitive, outmoded, so that you don't, and that actually undermines the self-reliance, identity, culture, language, knowledge of the peoples in much more subtle but much more long-term devious ways. And so it's easy to confront a mining company. It's much harder to confront something like this when it comes in ways that are supposed to be benevolent and good. And so therefore, what we're trying to do is to work with them and say, look, let's at least discuss these issues. Maybe there are examples of alternative education, alternative health, etc., that other indigenous people or other communities have developed, have been able to work out as an alternative to the state welfare schemes, which will help you to retain what you want to retain, but also help you to get from outside what you want to get, but on your terms, and in ways that are sort of, help maintain the forest and the local knowledge and things like that. That's a huge challenge. And I think we focus so much on resistance and protest and so on, which we have to. We have to obviously continue doing it, but we simultaneously need to envision different futures. And that, I think, comes from these sorts of examples that I gave and many others around the world. So even if it's a small one village thing, to me that's the value of that example, saying, okay, here is a real alternative that could be learned from, and a resistance movement then put it into place in their area on a larger scale or whatever. So.
Okay, it's 1 o'clock and we have how many questions more? 3 for sure? Okay. I have here Christos, I can't remember your name. No, the one at the back. Yes, you and Maria that I saw before. No? Okay. Shall we take quick questions now, like 2 or 3, and stay for 10 minutes more, or would you rather take it all to the afternoon session? Okay, let's take 3 questions quickly and then we can go to lunch.
Thanks. Well, I'll try to be as quick as possible. I think my question was kind of bringing together the commoning part and the consensus part. That's why I was waiting to ask it, because I thought we're not discussing consensus yet. Because I think in a sense, they're the same. Oops. They're the same mobile that rings all the time when you want to ask the question you've been waiting for. Because I think in a sense they're probably different aspects of the same issue, that is, what is the meaning of the collective? So first I kind of had a reflection on after Eric's point about commoning and about the importance of exclusion, which of course limiting things, putting borders is important, I can see that, but I also have a problem with celebrating exclusion as well. And I come from a strongly normative perspective on that, I acknowledge this, because I cannot see how we can change the world in the same way and using similar tools which have been used to create precisely the world that we don't like and the world that we reject. And I think exclusion has been key in this aspect, in creating the world that we know and we want to change. And I was also thinking that apart, perhaps from being normative, also, we can have empirical evidence of inclusion functioning. For example, in Barcelona, we have this new municipal government now, which is part of it was part of an initiative which is called Barcelona en Comú. This whole thing, as people like Melissa know pretty well, started from a platform, a civic platform, that try to fight for the rights of people who have mortgages and they have been evicted, they were evicted by the banks. Only by inclusion, or not only by inclusion, but inclusion, opening up to different social movements and to different priorities also help them move from being one very specific issue-related initiative to becoming a social and political force. And after that, they opened up even more and became a coalition of social and political forces that permitted them to take part in the elections and win the municipality. So they were opening up as they were going, getting more issues as well and more priorities into what they were doing and to what they were looking for. And they ended up winning the municipality, and who knows what comes afterwards as well, which is quite hopeful, I think, and you agree with that. And which takes me to the issue of consensus. And I think Stavros said something with which I very much identify. You said that you spoke about the importance of stepping back when we participate in processes where consensus is important, and I very much identify with this. I agree. I couldn't agree more. But I do acknowledge that there is a problem. What happens when you want to step back? And this is something I have found personally. This is a personal experience. But others don't want to step back. They just want to reclaim the power or the power vacuum that you leave in order for other voices to be expressed. And I mean, I do this consciously, and I will carry on doing it, but I also see this situation happening. It's frustrating personally, but it also frustrates the whole process of getting into consensus. So I was wondering, how do you navigate with this, and what is your point of view? Perhaps also Ashish wants to say something on it. And finally, just a very, very small point on this elitist drift and what also Stavros said about Rancière having participated. My experience of participating, I've been participating like for 4 years now in a squatted community gardens project, and I have in a project where 60 to 70% of the people who participate are working class people, 70 to 80 years old people, with whom we do assemblies, and I sometimes facilitate the assemblies. I have absolutely no power as an academic there. If I speak in the way I speak here, they will not understand anything. And not only they will not understand anything, I'm so powerless because I don't have the tools of a different language in order to convince them and to exercise power upon them. So I think at least my experience and the reality of participating, of opening up and becoming inclusive is that in the end, you do diffuse power and you do have to change the way you go about things and collectively form priorities. So, thanks.
I'm Ibrahim. I think one's commodification process involves the commons that transforms the characteristics of not only the characteristics of commons, but also the characteristics of social relation. Then there the social struggle involves manifest, which could be one of the many interpretations of social movements organized around the space, like squares in Gezi or Athens. My question is how far these movements can push to transform society or resist the hegemony of bourgeoisie and its state. If these movements fight the commodification process, in another word, capitalist modernization, what are the demands of these movements in material worlds too, not only imagination? Where are these movements leading society or leading to? Thank you.
Hello, I'm Kaner Atakan from Clark University. I have 2 questions for each of you. This may sound like a criticism, but actually it's not, Ashish. This is for you. How did you decide, because I always wanted to be that crystal clear whenever I'm writing something, how are you so clear that these are the values that are necessary? And you said that one-size-fits-all technical approach is not good whenever there is something good in, North America. Applying to Turkey might not be a good idea, but what about the values? If you impose them isn't it still a one-size-fits-all approach? And the second question comes to Stavros. You mentioned about capitalism, using the tools of capitalism. And for 2 days till I am here, maybe I'm mistaken, but I sensed the tone, the subtitle that we always want more of these good alternatives that we are having. And whenever we learned about capitalism, we always learned that it wants to grow, it wants more, it wants to expand. When we are using this language that we want more and more of these alternatives, are we still using the tools of capitalism by using this very same language? Thank you.
We'll come back in the afternoon. If it's a quick.
Like, just take these three and then
Yeah,
close it.
we'll have time in the
Sorry,
afternoon.
next session.
Okay. Well, I think Christos sort of more comments and additional comments to what we've said rather than questions. I'm just trying to look at whether, well, just maybe a quick comment back on your comment about inclusion and exclusion. I, again, completely agree with you that I think these movements have to be inclusive and not exclusive. Nevertheless, there will be things you still need to exclude or people that you still need to exclude. So it's always a balance, no? I mean, it's like you're still excluding those that will threaten, fundamentally undermine what you're trying to do. But you remain inclusive to all others who are seeking similar social justice or environmental aims or things like that. So, I mean, if that's the way in which you mean it, then yeah. Yeah, this question that you raised about what happens if, you know, I step back as somebody who's articulate or in some way have political, have influence in our decision making, but then somebody else misuses that space. It's actually similar to another question which I have, which is, if you take, say, issues of caste or gender or class or whatever, and you go in to a community in whatever, for either doing some studies or for being part of the initiative or helping them with resistance movements or whatever. And there's a set of values that you go in with which may not necessarily be what you're actually seeing on the ground. In India, for instance, some fantastic movements have happened, resistance movements have happened, where the decision making is still mostly by the men or only by the men. Now, somebody like me goes in and says, why are the women not taking part in decision making? And it's always a dilemma in my head as to whether it's my values that are coming in. Is it something I should be speaking about? It's obviously not something I should be imposing, but should I even be asking those questions? And the way I try and deal with it is to say, fundamentally, my sense of what is justice, I think I have the right to speak about it. I don't have the right to impose it, but I have the right to speak about it. And so one would end up having discussions, dialogue, questions, which, you know, it might enable me to expand my mind, it may enable whoever I'm talking to expand their minds and hearts. And the same, I think, would be in that situation which you spoke about, that if in fact somebody else misuses that space that I have voluntarily given up, I think I would have the right to say that I'm sorry, but this is a misuse. So I step back in. I guess one would have to do it in that way, right? I mean, because finally any action that we have to take is based on what my sense of right and wrong is. And too much of self-sacrifice in the name of being politically correct is also a problem, I think. Just quickly on the values question. Yeah, I mean, see, first of all, what's right and wrong is itself too complicated a question to get into here. But my sense of, again, as I said earlier, is of these movements and initiatives that I've either been part of or studied or, you know, been lucky enough to be involved with in one way or the other, is that at some level or the other, there are these common values that are held. Solidarity, for instance, is a value that is held in all across this. Interestingly enough, the rights of nature we as part of nature, but the rights of the rest of nature is also. But there, sometimes you'll see a difference. For instance, you will have, like, say, the urban wildlife groups talking about the rights of nature in a different way than what an indigenous community might. But then the dialogue between the two could actually help to see what is the common ground and also what are the differences that you might then respect amongst each other. If you go through that process over a number of years and over a number of different experiences and communities and so on, then what seems to me is that you'd arrive at some set of initial set of values which you can say, okay, I think these are the ones I believe in. So it's not something that's coming a priori to me, nor is it simply coming because it's what I learned in school or this is what Gandhiji said or whatever, but it's actually from that experience. And to me, after 35 years, I'm fairly convinced that this set of values is something I would like to continue working with, maybe expand it, maybe make it more nuanced, like I just said about rights of nature. But it's a fundamental set that I would like to hold to. And I think this finally also relates to the fact that as human beings, we also have to anchor ourselves in some set of values. And when we don't anchor ourselves in some set of values, then I think it's extremely confusing, chaotic, and we're drifting. And the big problem that I see with our education system in India today is that the inculcation of values, I don't mean imposition, but the facilitation of developing a set of values amongst children is gone. It's not there in our schooling anymore. Schooling is about information, power, money, fame. It's not about values. And I think that what these processes are trying to do is to say that we need to bring that, bring back values and bring back a collectively held set of values as through various different processes. So I mean, I would see it in that way, but I certainly sorry, last one. I said earlier that this process we're doing of the confluences is actually discussing each set of values. So we've done it 3 or 4 times. Next month there's another coming up in another part of India. 3 months down the line there's another one. This set of values that's come from the earlier confluences is going to go into the next few confluences, and we're going to keep discussing it. Maybe new things come up, maybe old things are in, like we had a disability rights activist in the last confluence, and he said, yeah, I'm fine with the set of values, but I think where is inclusion? And he was talking about inclusion in a very different way than how we went, than how the government talks about inclusive development and inclusive growth. And so I think it keeps evolving. And either getting reinforced or questioned, but it keeps evolving. I think that's how one needs to do it, rather than say, okay, here it is, this is my set of values, and I'm going to stick to it forever and ever.
About Christos' suggestions, I agree with most of them. I note something that is also an experience of mine. Sometimes, if we are not actually participating in experiences of local initiatives, we tend to imagine how they would be. And we tend to think that the power games or the power relations are specific the way we imagine them. And this is quite revealing. For example, equally, the problem of being an architect in a discussion of in a neighborhood discussion about the meaning of a rebuilding of a certain square was not, as I supposed, to be a problem of trying to step back from the role of the expert. Quite the opposite. People were already powerful enough in their opinions of how they would like to be their space, their square in the neighborhood. And I was impressed, although I wanted not to be the architect, and I said, okay, I can contribute to this discussion about how a square should be, and this square is destroying our lives if it's going to be finished and constructed the way the plans are. But people were already ahead of that, like the people in the urban garden. They were quite sure about what they wanted to do, about what they knew, and I was just, fighting with myself. The door was open, I was trying to open it. Okay. I deeply sympathize with Barcelona Común. It was indeed even more an interesting experiment than the political experiment of Podemos, because, as you said, it was created from various initiatives. It had, in a way, expressed the dynamism of the process through which it was constructed. It remains, of course, to be seen what are the next steps. Nobody can be sure about it. But indeed, all those processes should also be taken into account when we talk about levels of scale. This is a different scale from the Puerta del Sol occupation. Ibrahim, how far those movements can push to change society? To be absolutely honest, I don't know. Okay, but let's see. I mean, is the result in your recent elections completely uninfluenced? I don't know the word now, I'm a bit tired in my English, is deteriorating. Is the result not connected at all with the fact that people have taken to the streets, have done all this Gezi experience? The emergence of HDP, the creations of different arrangements in political power. Of course, this is not a change in the direction that we perhaps share as a vision. I don't know. I'm not sure about it. But it is a change. And it is being produced or co-produced by various other, like the Barcelona experience is also a result of the Indignados movement. Or if you want, the Syriza case in Athens, in Greece, is also, among other things, a result of the Syntagma Square occupation and the mobilization of people. So how far do those experiences can push the change of society? I really don't know. But what I know is that we have concrete indications that these are not irrelevant. And also, I would want to say once again that it is not a matter of quantity. We will have in this process qualitative leaps, ruptures, confrontations. I'm not reintroducing a pacifist understanding of society in which violence is outside there, but we are pacifists and we are creating our own society from below and we ignore all the others. No, this is a confrontational process. But I agree with Ashish and many of you, I guess, on the fact that in the process of fighting for our survival and protecting ourselves, we need to develop elements of this other society now, in the process, and check them if you want. This is perhaps the most, if you want, true form of saying that we are not very sure, we are not absolutely sure about the ways that this other society will be. We are not utopian thinkers developing a picture of the future as it should be and then saying, let's find ways to go there. No, we are walking and thinking about it, and we need those experiences, not only to protect our lives, because they are essential for our lives, but also to find out how else could things be. And I think the importance of progressive governments or progressive political organizations inside this system is more or less that. Is it opening spaces for practices that can show that things have been otherwise? People need to see that things can be otherwise. It's a long tradition of the left and the anarchist movement of describing capitalism as absolute catastrophe. It is absolute catastrophe. We don't need anymore to say that to people. They see it. We need to convince ourselves and all the others that there is a possibility of a different society. And this can be shown not only by reading books about it, but seeing how things can be. Seeing that solidarity is better than aggressiveness, that it creates indeed very rewarding human relations. Not because it is good, but it is also part of our experience. So, and then we go, Caner, to the problem of values. If you want an aphorism, the problem for me is not being normative. The problem is hiding it. We are all normative. We are all involved in values. And we suffer as academics sometimes with this, imaginative, this projection of imagination that considers us at least as not involved in what we study. We are trying to step back and say the truth or whatever, objectivity, whatever. No, we are involved in it. We are involved in it and deeply involved in it. And it's more, it's better to express your values and say, listen, I might be wrong, but I'm saying this from this position. I'm taking sides. I'm with those and against those. I'm here. Or consider this as a gesture, but you can judge it. This guy is pretending to be, but he's not actually. Okay, say whatever you want. But I'm expressing those values. I'm not expressing descriptions or statements that try to interpret certain mechanisms in process. So, a very subtle question, I would say, Kaner, about is capitalism is also expanding, so why say, let's expand? Indeed, but also nature is expanding and life is expanding. So, let's be careful about this comparison. Indeed, on the level of the term, you are right. But what is capitalism doing by expanding? Not including, excluding, and taking advantage of. That is destroying some people, and certainly not inviting people to co-produce this expansion. Okay, so this is a system which destroys through expanding. Let's find a way of inventing, creating through expanding, like life. If we want to make this comparison more specific. So it's not a quantitative expansion that I'm talking about in commoning. I'm talking about a process in which all those who are invited are co-producers. It's a huge difference. They are not invited to something which exists apart from their presence, apart from their ideas, No, let's see what we can. Of course, there are some principles, but these principles are already developed in the process. Just a final example. The assembly of Syntagma Square was a revelation for me, because it was not of the kind of assemblies that I was used to. And I have to admit that in my earlier years as a union student, I was very good in convincing people about the rightness of our approach as that part of left against the other part of left, which was always, of course, the most fierce enemy. But the Assembly of Syntagma has devised two things. First of all, small talks, not like mine. Then also, the one who is chosen to speak, to address the assembly, would be chosen by lot. So it's 40 people that want to speak tonight. Let's not make it an assembly until 5 in the morning, which is obviously excluding lots of people, because only students can stay as far as that. Others have to work the other day, most of them at least. So we cannot talk all of us. 10, 20. Let's draw lots, so that you cannot organize the first 20 that try to make this assembly as it is. Yes, it has its disadvantages. It has its maybe it can create monsters sometimes. But it is more important as an experiment, even more important as a process than the result itself. Exactly as the Zapatista municipalities, which have a rotation every 20 days. And in terms of management understanding, this is absolutely crazy, absolutely inefficient. But you know what they say? No, it's more important for us to educate our people in democracy and in governing as equals than in taking the most appropriate decisions. It can create problems, but it's more important, the process is more important than the problems that it creates. So, this is my answering to those, at least my attempt to answer.
Okay, thank you everyone for the session. Let's go for lunch and come back half an hour later at 3 o'clock.
Just one moment, please, before you get up and go. We wanted to explain again exactly what we're thinking for after lunch. First of all, we thought we'd meet just for 1 hour since we went over half an hour in the session. So we'd meet from 3 to 4. And what we thought specifically, because the title of the next session is The Role of Ecology, Democracy, and Alternative Epistemologies in the Analysis and Praxis of Environmental Politics. So this is like a very big topic. And what we thought we could do in this is that people who have specific things they're working on related to this broader theme could briefly present. We'll be in a more intimate space where we won't be in this kind of strange dynamic. And we can kind of reflect with the help of Ashish and Stavros on the work. And this is what we imagine for this next session. So again, we're meeting at 3, and Amani will explain to us exactly where it is.